thank you for inviting me, and I'm very pleased that so many of you have come to this lecture, because I know it's the first day of the Thanksgiving week. What I want to do is, as mentioned, to talk about different types of different new forms of active participation. But first, I wanted short go through what I intend to do during the next probably 3 quarters. Why the increased interest for civic participation, new forms of organization? Because first of all, because there are a lot of changes in the society, and I will deal with the new social risk, the growing inequality, and its consequences, go into what Guy Standing talks about as the precariat. Then, in addition to these structural changes in the labor market, in the economy, there are also a lot of changes, at least in Europe, in our welfare state system. These changes I will shortly go through. Then I will come with one empirical illustration, one of several empirical illustrations, the relation between perceived economic deprivation and political participation among citizens in the EU countries. And following this, I will discuss the activist citizenship, how to accomplish participatory democracy, and then, if I have time, I will go into the debate about Polanyi, Nancy Fraser. That's a debate mostly by Nancy Fraser, but as you probably know, The Great Society by Polanyi has been very relevant during this period of neoliberal economic policy. Finally, I will share with you some of my ideas about civil actors and their role in creating a more equal and democratic society. That's what I hoped to reach during this lecture. First of all, discussing of the economic and social crisis in Europe has placed the involvement of citizens and on the political agenda, and accentuated the importance of civic activities. And that's because there are, in the present definition of social rights, a lot of difficulties in involving citizens in the decision-making processes at community as well as national level. We have experienced a declining involvement, both at the political but also at the social level. And of course, it has many reasons, but one of the reasons is the difficulties in identifying social welfare services, and especially for the vulnerable group, the universalistic European welfare state has had quite substantial difficulties in capture their needs, in capture what they want, and their social and political situation. And that's, of course, because the prevailing forms of democracy, the representative democracy, have several and huge problems in capturing the heterogeneity, the complex interest, and the identity problems in our societies. Large groups of the population are not represented in the democratic processes of governance, and they are not dealt with in an accurate way in the social welfare policies. In this lecture, I will not deal that much about on the crisis of legitimacy, but what I want to do is to focus on 3 issues: how to enhance participation of citizens, considering the declining trust in social and political institutions, and mostly I'm talking about the European situation. I'm not that familiar with the American situation, but at least reading what you have done here, you have definitely the same problems. The social and economic and cultural resources are very unequal distributed in nearly all Western societies. How to ensure parity in participation, to use the Nancy Fraser phrase? How does active participation affect citizens who are excluded from the different types of participation? And that's one of my main questions, and also one of my main inquiries. One major consequence of the complex economic and social changes which takes place in the European welfare state is what I have termed, or what others have termed, the new social risk, which are a growing part of the social problems in today's societies. And these social risks are important because and they have many phases, but the most important are the deindustrialization of employment, which have created quite substantial unemployment among industrial workers, and of course especially among low educated workers. But we have seen in all the European countries a substantial increase in unemployment. Growing instability in the family structure because of increasing number of divorce, single living, lone parenthood, etc. And finally, the destandardization of employment with the growth of atypical career pattern. Nearly one in Denmark, nearly one quarter of the labor force are in some kind of atypical career pattern today, which is, and this number are growing. Talking about the southern European countries, it's up to half of the population which are in these different types of employment. The structural transformation which I have meant have led to new types of inequality. Growing income inequality. That's all over. Polarization between working rich and working poor. One of my other topics besides citizenship and participation is family work relations. And here you find very clear that both types of families are in trouble. One due to lack of time, another due to lack of money. Then there are, the risk of poverty has increased among the vulnerable groups, lone mothers, young and low educated. The welfare system in all the European countries are under pressure. It's not able to solve the new types of risk, unemployment, financial constraints, and partly because of the globalization of both labor and capital. As you probably know, the unemployment rates in Southern Europe are about 1/4 of the working population are unemployed. Among young people below 30, it's about half of them who are unemployed. Okay, something has happened, but never mind. During the transformation process to the computer, it was much nicer when I saw it. In the post-industrial societies, this structural transformation of the society has affected all groups, not just the marginalized group, which I mentioned before, but all such as unskilled young people, etc. That is what Guy Standing, the British economist who have written a very popular and very much cited book about the precariat. And these groups represent a new social class characterized by living in a constant state of employment and unemployment security. You see? No, that's not right. Excuse me. This group can be defined by three groups of persons. First of all, the members. Just a moment. First of all, the members of the traditional working class, mostly unskilled, who have lost their job due to outsourcing or industrial restructuring. Second, the migrants with few and no citizenship rights, the denizens. And finally, and that's probably the most important, it's not serious that the other two groups are in trouble, but young educated people who have been forced to take up unqualified jobs. And in nearly, at least in all European countries, it takes, for the most lucky, 1 year to get a job after you have been educated. In the southern European countries, many young people are long-term unemployed. And here I again want to refer to the Danish labor market. Here, about 1/3 of the newly educated, high-skilled with a master education, they are unemployed more than 1 year before they get a job. And many of them, of course, take what Guy Standing talks about as low-skilled jobs, and in this respect get in a very precarious situation. Hopefully the next one, yes. In solving the problems, two strategies have been used. So far I have talked about the structural change. Now I want to talk about slightly about what kind of reactions there have been from the welfare state, from the welfare system. In solving the problems mentioned, there are two strategies which have been used. First of all, what they call the social investment strategy, which means that the social welfare is still more related to employment reforms, flexicurity, and employability. Second, the capability strategy, which is taken from Amartya Sen, which focus on the individual's opportunity and capability to do and to be what they want to appreciate. Both strategies in both strategies, it is accepted that people are different, should have the opportunities to realize their individual needs and demands. Reduction of poverty must be achieved by investing in people's capability to realize their individual potentials. In implementing these approaches, both the social investment strategy and the capability strategy, we cannot expect a redistribution of the economic, social, and cultural and political resources compared to now. That means these strategies individualize the situation of the citizens. By focusing on these two strategies, the concept of citizenship has been transformed from a social right to a social opportunity, and this change has several consequences for integration of citizens and for implementing equality. First of all, citizenship has been transformed from a status to a praxis of political involvement. Second, integration into the market has priority instead of protection from the market, which was the original welfare state's strategy. Capability to change instead of protection against change. Citizenship becomes the arena where rights and responsibilities are defined, claimed, and defended. And finally, citizenship as a legal right is unable to reflect the diversity in need and aspirations expressed by the different social groups. Here I want to illustrate the relationship between deprivation and political participation. Based on European Social Survey, I have done a study of the perceived economic deprivation of citizens and how much they are involved in political activities. And that means not voting, but political activities by side being a voter. And here the main conclusion of this study is first, on the aggregate level, there are a negative correlation between political and civic engagement. Political civic engagement in this respect is doing a petition, doing strikes, political actions, and different kind of political intervention outside the legal or the political parties. And there are negative correlation in Europe. Second, the Nordic countries have generally a higher level of political and civic participation than in the rest of Europe. Third, on the individual level, I find a much more complex relation between economic deprivation and political participation. In the Nordic countries, citizens who have experienced economic deprivations during the economic crisis are much more likely to be engaged in political activities than citizens in the other welfare regimes. The difference is most clear between the Nordic countries and the Southern European countries. It's not it's slightly in between when we are talking about Germany, UK, etc. But between the South and North, there are clear difference. My conclusion based on these results is, first of all, the Nordic citizens expect that the government protect them against market risk. That's the normal conventional welfare strategy. Material deprivation as a consequence of the crisis is among Nordic citizens, created eligible claims which may motivate their political actions. Second, the political opportunity structure in the Nordic countries encourage economic deprived people to be engaged in different types of political action. And third, the redistribution of non-material capabilities such as civic skills make it possible for economic deprived people to organize political action in order to raise their critique. First of all, and probably beside this, I will say that if you have a more equal society and more possibilities in the society, then you also have a higher level of civic participation. I have, beside this, I'm studying volunteering. And the level of volunteering is higher in the Nordic countries and Netherlands than in any other countries in the OECD area. In US, you have about 1/4 of the population being volunteers. In Sweden, you have 1/2 of the population being in some kind of volunteering activities inside formal organizations. That says something about the importance of what Fraser called parity in participation, and the necessary the need for redistribution to make sure that all people are able to participate in the political processes. If you have questions, if you have comments, you are free to come with them during my lecture. And sometimes it's better to come to react spontaneously than to wait until I can stick to it, and I can skip some part of it if it's possible. So please feel free to react if you oppose it, if you want to tell me something I don't know. The emergence of the precariat, as well as the restructuring of the citizenship, means that the connection between citizenship rights, economic equality, and democratic institutions become crucial. In defining social and political rights of the citizens, the attention must shift from the formal citizenship rights and instead focus on what I will call act of claiming citizenship. Being an activist citizen. And the act of claiming citizenship becomes today more and more crucial because the rights, the social rights, also in the Scandinavian countries, which used to be, at least Sweden used to be a home of welfare capitalism. They are more and more diminished. They are more and more questioned. And if the citizens are not claiming their rights, then they will lose them. The activists are citizens. The activist citizens are citizens who demand right and obligation, and who, through their actions as citizens, require inclusion not only of themselves, but of the vulnerable groups that are not insiders, those who are outsiders or complete excluded. So we can in this context define act of citizenship as act through which political actors intervene in favor of groups that are excluded from the established norm of citizenship. It's taken partly from Ising, and British political scientist. But also I am very much inspired by the old Marxist Etienne Balibar, who have done quite a lot of studies of the group in France called Sans Papiers. That's a group who have migrants, non-citizens, they have not the legal citizenship right in France, who organized several local actions, and through these local actions they got some rights. Of course not full citizenship rights, but they got rights to have a stay, to live. They got rights to at least minimum benefits, etc. And through this act of citizenship, they become at least partly accepted as citizen. How much time do I have? 15 minutes more. I probably skip the discussion of Polanyi phrase. Okay, I take some of it. Then I have to skip something. For Polanyi, the capitalist crisis was less about economic breakdown in a narrow sense, but more about disintegrated communities, ruptured solidarity, and spoiled nature. That means the consequences of free market forces, which Europe, as well as other parts of the capitalist world, experienced during the 1920s, 1930s. A situation which is very much similar to the situation in most countries today. And then Fraser argue that Polanyi tries to overcome economism by whitewashing forms of social protection that, according to her, are in the same way characterized by domination. He neglects struggles against injustices rooted in the society and encoded in the social protection, social control, regulation of the social rights, and surveillance. I read because I was sitting at O'Hare Airport quite long, so I had time to read the New York Times. And there was a long article, I can't remember the author, in the Sunday section, talking about in the area where most people are on social benefits, in this area, the political agenda has shifted from a democratic support to a Republican support. And many of the people he talked with was precisely people who were upset of the social control, who were upset of the many regulations there have been of Medicare, food stamps, etc. And when they get out of it, and they succeeded to get out of it, that means climb a bit up, then they reacted against the public sector. And the consequence has been that in Kentucky and West Virginia, etc., those are most in need of these social benefits either not vote, nor if they have accomplished to come out to get out of it, they are fed up with the state and the welfare system. Fraser wants in her critique at Polanyi to develop a non-economic understanding of the capitalist society, and that incorporate emancipation, or what I will call the activist citizenship. In this respect, Fraser develops a critique that includes society, that means the social as well as the economic sphere. By introducing emancipation, Fraser wants to cross-cut Polanyi's conflict between marketization and social protection, and she argues for the importance of the public sphere of civil society. Struggles for emancipation constitute the missing link that mediates conflict between marketization and social protection. According to Fraser, Polanyi acknowledged oppression and domination in the economic sphere, but not in the social sphere. That means in the sphere of social security, and that's what I precisely talked about before. And here, Fraser adds a third movement to the Polanyi's double movement between regulation and non-regulation. And this third dimension, emancipation, is possible. Then it is possible to establish a further sphere in addition to society, economy, and the state. And this sphere is the public sphere of civil society, which make it possible to understand participation and control in the society. The public sphere of civil society is testing ground through which norms guiding social protection may be evaluated. The critical scrutiny of the state initiative make sure that social protection are not misframed towards specific groups. Here, Fraser introduced the concept participatory parity. This principle targets damages associated with the four institutional centers: society, economy, state, and the public sphere. And that means what she argued for and have argued for quite long, which is important, that it prevent both misrecognition of specific groups of people. It prevent maldistribution and encourage redistribution. And most important, it prevent misrepresentation. And then going back to my discussion of Act of Citizens, this representation is extremely important. I don't know that much about what takes place today, but an old colleague or friend of mine, Francie Fox-Piven from the New School, yes. She spent quite a lot of her life with organizing registration of voters. And I think that's probably one of the most important issue for the moment, at least here in the Scandinavian countries and in most European countries. You are, yes, even in some of them you are forced to vote, and if you don't vote, you can be filed. But it's extremely important to have a strong representation among the most needed. I will try now to give two examples of how the active participation, active involvement in different social issues are dealt with and have appeared during the last couple of years in Denmark. And one is the role of non-profit organizations and citizens in relation to the refugee crisis. We, as you probably know, receive a lot of refugees in all the European countries, also in the Nordic countries, and much more in Sweden than in Denmark. But still, there are a substantial amount. And here, it has normally been two main formal non-profit organizations who have taken care of these refugees: Danish Red Cross and the Danish Refugee Council. These two organizations are very formalized. They are cooperating with the state, and of course they have quite limited possibilities to go into defense of the refugees, because they are the organizer of their stay. But then, during the last 2 years, we have seen new actors. And these new actors are groups which have been organized completely based on Facebook, Twitter. And they have no formal organization. In Denmark, we used to have a formal organization. When we want to do something outside the state and the economy, we set up an organization with statutes, board, and general assembly, all this stuff. But these three organizations have been established spontaneously. And for the first one, they have more followers, they're more active members than probably the two formal organizations have together. And what they are doing, they are organizing different events. They are organizing meals. They are organizing get-together for the refugees. And they try, of course, to argue for their their rights and their integration in the society. And here we have, of course, a problem. Is it just a temporary phenomenon, or will it be lasting? In some sense, I think that they need to have at least some kind of formal structure. But probably I'm not right, and it's too conventional. At least they have been very successful in setting the agenda, both in the public and especially in relation to to establish a kind of friendly atmosphere for many of the refugees, despite the official political attitudes, which are very reluctant. The other example, Steve knows probably more than I about, that's our a new political party which have been established. This political party was established without any formal organization. If it's possible to have 20,000 people to sign up in Denmark, you can run for the parliament. And this party established, made this, and then they started a process of political laboratories. They started a process of inviting people without any formal requests for membership, etc., asking them for good ideas, asking them for developing political demands and guidelines for the program for the upcoming election. Then all these issues, I think it was several thousand good proposals which came up. It was, of course, discussed, and there were decided as a structure or a harmonizing of all the proposals was made by a committee. But this committee was elected by the laboratories. So it was not a committee, central committee. It was a committee elected through the laboratories. And then, in fact, actually everybody was a bit skeptical, to say it mild, that they came into the parliament, but they succeeded in came into the parliament with 9 members out of 170. So in this respect, they have succeeded without any structure. Now they have got some structure. And that's precisely what happens today. There are growing discrepancies between what can be accomplished in the political negotiation through formal political procedures and the constituency of the party. That means all the ordinary supporters. So in this respect, it's it's only half a year ago they came into the parliament, and they have already been quite a substantial number of debates within the party. Should they accept the political rules for what can be done in the parliament? That means all this compromising. In the relation between civil society, civic participation, and citizenship, autonomy plays a crucial role. Autonomy is here understood in a very broad sense as organizational independency of independency for civil society actors and organizations from both the state and the market institutions. Emerging of new participatory institutions or participatory entities, because it's not institutions in the normal sense, it's loosely formed organizations. We have several examples. The alternative, the Danish party, is just one. I try for the moment to compare this party with Podemos in Spain, which has established their party in nearly the same way by involving ordinary citizens in the process. In some of the local elections in Spain, they just gathered in meetings, and then at these meetings they asked people would they stand for being for election, be representative for a special ticket, and of course they have to sign to specific guidelines and accepting of human rights and all this stuff. But then there were no discussion and no political party behind. And many of these people came into the local and regional assemblies. And today, as I understand, many of them are functioning quite well and in coordination and in continuously contact with their constituencies in the local area. We have to see how much success Podemos will make in the upcoming Spanish general election. Then I will turn to and try to conceptualize what I want to see as a civil society. And here I quote Mike Edwards, who you probably know. He has been director in Ford Foundation, the development section, and he left Ford Foundation during according to bureaucratization and according to shift in their priorities. But he has written several books about civil society. In one of them, he tried to define what civil society or civic activities are all about. It's about collective action in association across society and through the public sphere. And as such provide an essential counterweight to individualism. It's also creative action. Civic organizations must provide a much needed antidote to the cynicism that infects so much of contemporary politics. And finally, value-based action. They must provide a balance in the otherwise overwhelming in the influence of the state authorities and in the temptation and initiatives of the market. That means three crucial elements of all civic action: collective action, creative action, artistic action, value-based action. And then I invite you to discuss the following question: challenging, confronting the civic organization in a democratic society. How to involve civic society actors in a dialogue with the welfare state institution in an emancipatory way to enhance public participation, to enhance parity in participation. Is it possible through activist citizenship to counteract the increasing cultural and ethnic differentiation in all democratic societies? And here I think that it's extremely important to be realistic. But of course, because in most civic organizations, it is the outspoken, it's the resource, it's the powerful people who take the lead. And many of these organizations probably don't care that much about the more vulnerable groups. And therefore, I want in my research to insist on the activist citizenship and the role of the activist citizens as I defined it, that it's not only activism for yourself, but it's also activism including the most vulnerable groups. Is it possible to combine the particularistic interest represented by many civil society actors with a more universalistic approach taken by the welfare state? And here, feminists in many years have talked about differentiated universalism in the Scandinavian countries, because there are people are not that uniform. They have different needs, and these needs become more and more obvious, both between men and women, both between the different type of families, but also between the different ethnic groups in the society. And here, the traditional welfare states are not able to cope with these differences. We see it clearly in the Scandinavian countries, because every time a new social problem pop up, then there have been, at least, probably not that much more, but there have been a tendency to set up a new rule, a new law. But it concerns all. So is it possible to combine the particularistic interest and the universalistic approach taken by the welfare state in avoiding a reinforcement of the already existing social, political, and cultural clivages in the society? And finally, how can participatory procedures and institutions influence public policy, influence political outcome, and the civic and political praxis in the different institutional settings? It's large questions, but I think it's some of the, at least for me, some of the crucial questions when we talk about active participation, activist participation, and we talk about a more emancipatory type of involvement of ordinary people. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we have about 30 minutes. I think. So I actually, Thomas, want to ask you about some of the questions that you're dealing with right here, which is something which I've been thinking of as sort of the problem of interface. And how do these organizations, for lack of a better term, that are fluid, that are informal, that are spontaneous, or that are sort of radically democratic, interface with what the state actually has to deliver? And I always, this is when I talk to the folks in the alternative, one of the questions I asked them was, what is your plan for the sewer system of Copenhagen?
What's the plan on
For the sewer system of Copenhagen? That is that the state does have to actually provide certain sort of universalistic needs. And my question was really about how do you interface with the state apparati that actually have to be sort of big hulking bureaucracies. And this can be, how do you resettle 60,000 people? Or how do you deliver sewer systems when you're doing your organized through loose organizations through Facebook, or when you're actually always constantly coming up with new ideas for these democratic laboratories? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it is, but I don't think you phrase a wrong question, or you are not have not confidence in these people, because there are nobody of these activists or who don't recognize that we need an infrastructure, that we need basic education, that we need different types of social protection. But what they want is to create this, not the sanitarian structure or something more inclusive, because that should, of course, include everybody. But what we need is a discussion. Does the different types of political initiatives, political regulation, hurt specific groups of people? Does it create discrimination? Does the regulation, take the example of the migrants coming to Denmark? I also read in the long list how many procedures should be taken into consideration if you want to have a US citizenship. It takes 2 years. Maybe it can be regulated in another way, and maybe also the receiving of migrants can be done in a more trustful, in a more clear, solidaristic way, and it has been done. And that's precisely what these organizations try to do, because when we have seen several examples of in the last year, that when the migrants have been accepted, not as citizens, because that's also in Denmark take a long time, but when they have been introduced in a kindly way, then they also give you something back, offer you, and become probably even more friendly, even more acceptable as a society. And that's precisely what they can do, in addition to the more borrowing political action. Because every year you have to make a budget in the municipality, in the state, and at the federal level. But these budgets can be questioned in not on the basic issues, but on the different marginal issues where there are discrimination. And that's precisely what they do, and what they try to do also in the alternative.
Question. purely recorded. You get the answer.
I think in terms of your first question, I guess an additional question that I find challenging is, a lot of the internet technology that enables this has built-in sort of an implicit bias of essentially libertarian ethos, right? So a lot of this open source and bottom-up participatory culture tends to kind of ignore state power, like how do we build high-speed rail or sanitation. So to me, the question more specifically is, how do we enable this bottom-up or more porous civic participation without actually encouraging a radical libertarian, because basically it ends up being corporate, taken over by corporate power as a way to say, get rid of big government, and we just, private interests need to take over. So how do, that to me seems to be one of the big gaps and challenges of, in the UK, when the Tories took over, they released like an open source urbanism white paper that basically said we need local control. But it sounded all good, but basically what was left unsaid was that means local business interests will end up determining, real estate business interests will determine the planning, urban planning policy. So what do you,
That's as I understand it, it's, you ask, or you phrase it, if we rely on local actors, on civic society actors, which mostly very often are organized in according to specific interests, then we miss the more general protection of the population. But that's precisely my third question. My third issue is how to combine particularistic interest, because there will also always be particular interest in the society. How to combine them with a basic universal protection system. I don't think my good friend Guy Standing, he argued and have for many years argued for a basic income system. That could be one solution, that you establish a system where everybody without control, without means testing, get a certain amount of money. Of course, if they earn them themselves, they will not have them, but there will be a guarantee of $20,000 or 25,000. I don't know the level, the poverty level exactly in my mind, in my head. And but there could be established a system. That means in the Scandinavian, in the Danish context, we will get rid of all this different system, sickness benefit, unemployment benefit, different types of additional support if you had this system, and you don't need to be means tested. That would give at least a basis for a solidaristic policy. But taking the UK situation, I have done some research on the effects of big society, which the first Cameron government created a huge fund, the Big Society Fund, and instead of and that should replace a lot of the social support for local communities, and it should replace all the different types of support for groups of needed people, because they should organize themselves, and they could then apply for funding to infrastructure, etc. What happens? It functioned well in the southern part of UK, where people are rich, well educated, around London and the southern east part. But in the northern part, in the countryside, in the more rural area, the system collapsed. Library collapsed. Social institutions for young people collapsed. The uprising in Tottenham for 2 years ago during the summer, it was precisely because some of the activity houses paid by the councils was closed, and people had only to be in the streets. And that always creates some, yes? No, no. Excuse me.
But it was never taken seriously by anybody as a proper attempt to provide power. Nobody thought that the powers that were given locally were trivial. They were people of library. It wasn't the comprehensive any power education services that you suggested. So I don't think it served any purpose as an empirical example of the kind of thing we're trying to talk about. A much better example, which seems to me to answer a lot of these questions, and surprise me. And the question you haven't mentioned is what happened in Porto Alegre in Brazil, where there were 10-year experiments of mass participation over city services, over things like sewers, public services, hospitals, schools, which demonstrated that when you give the power to the local assembly and encourage mass participation, you not only get mass participation, but you also get an emerging civic debate. But above all, what you get, contrary to your point, sir, is not a co-option by business or libertarian interests, which is perhaps something you suspect might happen here. But in Brazil, what it produced was much more equalitarian outcomes. A survey done by the World Bank, no less, demonstrated that this participatory experiment produced much more outcomes in terms of policies, including things like water and sanitation, the education, and hospitals. So this seems to me to have answered quite comprehensively a lot of these problems that you put there. And I'm surprised that it hasn't been included in your presentation.
I am very much aware of the participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre and other places, but I am also in most of my presentations for 2 years ago, I probably would have taken this as an example. But during the last years, there have also been some studies showing that it has lost some of its potential participatory effects. I completely right.
It's been stopped.
I beg your pardon?
It's been stopped by a different mayor. A different mayor took over and basically stopped it.
Yes, and also some of the participatory, some of the participants seems to be paid by the big firms to vote or to act in a specific way, and that's at least what I have heard and talked by talking to people in Brazil. And that's probably not correct, but at least I have not studied it. I only know from the research which have been done of participatory budgeting. And you are correct that in the at least in the original type, it was the resources was distributed much more equal. There were much more civic activities, and the tax claiming became much higher, and the civic there were established quite a lot of civic organizations based on these community meetings and so on. I completely agree, but there have also been, as I mentioned, this criticism and reluctancy in relation to the success of it. Okay, coming back to your discussion of big society, actually, as I have followed it, some of the purpose was to activate, to create independency at the local level, based on civic activities. It has not happened because the infrastructure for many of these civic activities have been spoiled due to cuts in support. And that's also what we find in many other countries, that if you don't provide the infrastructure, economic support for the infrastructure for civic organizations, then it becomes much more difficult to establish them. But what my point is that it's fine that we should provide this infrastructure, but we should not set up, as happened today, conditions for how to deal with the money that the different organizations get, because then we make them dependent of the public sector, of the state, or of the municipality, etc. Yes.
Yeah, I think one of the problems today is what we're seeing in Europe is you have a political and business elite who increasingly regard themselves and their endeavors as a stateless or a supra-state entity. And consequently, what you have is a situation where most of the folks in Europe haven't been consulted about this mass migration. In most countries, including Germany, I don't know, did I lose my power here? Hello? Okay. Even 70% of Germans are opposed to Merkel welcoming everybody now. And the problem that Europe has is not being able to coordinate any kind of military or security apparatus on the perimeter, because there's so many different entities and the issues that Greece has, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being is that what we're seeing is that both the global elites and the very wealthy and the very poor increasingly inhabit a stateless world. Though the migrants are stateless in a sense, as the elites are. And it is the people who have not been consulted about humanitarian, quote-unquote, initiatives being done in their name, which are also draining the coffers of a lot of these countries, which competes against the capacity to finance things or to implement local programs. So what I'm questioning is, how do you see a resolution between this globalist imperative, which looks at the state or looks at localities as something to be taken from, and local folks who are being taken from and thus can't put their energies and efforts and monies into the building of these local initiatives?
It's a big question. But
right now, too.
yes, it's concerning Europe. I think the main problem in Europe is lack of solidarity, not only between the poor and the rich, but also between the poor and troubled states in the southern part of Europe and the more wealthy, well-established states in the northern part. We have a system in Europe which create a schisma between the Europeans as citizen and the European political parties, political determination system, because every state has vetoed, have possibilities to veto all decisions taken in the European Union. And that means it's a complex mix between a democratic system and a system of independent states. And that's precisely what has happened during the economic crisis, during the climate discussion of the climate crisis, and now in relation to the refugee crisis. Some countries in the eastern part and also in some of the western countries have, including my own country, have rejected or more or less to take part of and accept the refugee crisis. And other countries, Germany and Sweden, has taken a substantial higher, or Hungary, but not by their goodwill, but because they came through Hungary, have taken a substantial higher proportion. Instead of sharing the responsibility between the countries, that would have been a solidaristic attitude, because you have today 10, 15 million of migrants without any hope of returning to their homeland during the next 5 or 6, most probably many more years. Therefore, as Canada has done yesterday, taken 25,000, we probably should share this responsibility. And I agree with you that the European Union, as it has been structured during the last decades, is an elite project. It's a project which has not taken into consideration that you need to have the constituencies with you, and the only way to have the constituencies with you is, and their support, is to establish a social union. We have a free flow of capital. We have free flow of labor force so far within the most European countries, but we have no social system which in any sense are equal. And that's a problem for the moment. That's also, together with the refugee, the opposition against refugees, that's the main problem for the European society. So when people are talking about more Europe instead of less Europe, I think it's very relevant.
We have time for about one more question. Someone new, ideally. Yes.
Yeah, I actually have 2 questions, so very brief. I mean, while I think it's very laudable that 50% of Swedes volunteer, I think Robert Putnam, 15 or 20 years ago, basically already pointed out that there was a measurable decline in volunteering here in the United States. Mm. And I think it's also an empirical fact that you can see this in many other Western countries. So while I think you're obviously making a very good argument between civic engagement and greater economic rights or social rights, if you look at the empirical data, it seems that people are getting less and less engaged in civic and political affairs. So the first question would be like, how do you address this? I mean, you pointed out that one could think of providing a better infrastructure, but who would do this and how would this work exactly? The second question that I have is, we're obviously talking about basically national mobilization of citizens. However, if you look at the structural problems, for example, the ones that are connected to globalization, the question would be, wouldn't you have to do this on a global level to really deal or address the structural problems that many populations or societies face, including basically the effects of the precariat? So I think just stopping at the national level, I think probably will not do the trick, I guess. Now, obviously, I mean, we have the Global Social Summit, that goes around every year. But the question is, could one conceive of a global movement that would do this job that you are proposing on a national level?
To your last question, I don't hope I have talked about national mobilization, but the conditions for citizenship, the conditions for mobilization is still the national identity and the national. Unfortunately, also in Europe, we are dealing with the problems, most of the problems, on the national level. And therefore, of course, also citizenship are on the more or less on the national level, at least. We also have a European citizenship, but it has no. It has a right to move around, but it has no substantial rights to social benefits, to cultural activities, and so on. So I agree with you that a global mobilization, global citizenship, cosmopolitan citizenship, as Ulrich Beck are talking about, is the right way. But I think it's even farther away than establishing a more solidaristic attitude at the national and at the European level. The second question, the first question, declining participation. Yes, Putnam argue that it has declined here. It's correct. The latest Bureau of Labor Statistics show that during the last 10 years there have been a slow decline from 26 to 24%. But remember, when Putnam count participation, he counted as formal participation in organizations. And when we in Denmark count participation, we also count it in formal participation. It's about 40%. But in addition to this, you have a more informal participation in the local neighborhood. It's about 60% of the population. Of course, some of them are doing both, but at least 20% are doing only informal participation. And all this kind of participation wouldn't be counted as social capital in the Putnam sense, because it's not within a formal structure. And the phrasing of the questions by Putnam is precisely, are you volunteering within a formal organization?
Can you see a measurable empirical increase of, let's say, those forms of participation?
In Scandinavian, yes. In no. But that's probably because of an increasing inequality in many countries. And that's precisely what I'm dealing with. That's the issue of the more inequality, the more differentiation within the population, the less tendencies to formal volunteering. But still, there are relatively high informal. When I compare the different Europeans, I have another lecture about volunteering and in different forms. When I compare the different European countries concerning formal and informal volunteering, then there are nearly the same level in all the European, in South European and Northern European, when we talk about social support and when we talk to others, and when we talk about informal help to neighbors, family, but of course family outside your household, and friends. Support both economically and socially. When you count this, they are nearly the same level in all the European countries. Where we differ is in formal organizational volunteering. There were one more question, I think. Okay.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you all.